Hi, Josh.
Hey, John.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Welcome to Blogging Heads TV. Let me just quickly introduce myself, and then you can introduce yourself. I'm John Horgan. I'm a science journalist and a semi-regular correspondent for Blogging Heads TV. And I have with me today a young philosopher named Joshua Knobe. Is that how you pronounce your name?
It's actually Knobe, so any letter that could be silent is pronounced silently.
Okay, Knobe. Well, nice to meet you, Josh.
And good to meet you.
So why don't you, first of all, tell people... by the way, you're at the University of North Carolina now?
Mm-hmm.
So why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about your background. How did you become interested in philosophy in the first place?
Well, I was always interested in philosophy, so I didn't have very much trouble figuring out that was what I was interested in. The real struggle for me was about whether to go into academia. So from the very first moment, say when I was in high school, I was just always writing philosophical papers out on little sheets of notebook paper. I was constantly trying to deal with philosophical problems. And similarly, in college, I was interested in these questions. But I had this tremendous fear of academia, of becoming an academic. So after college, instead of just going into graduate school, I decided I'm going to continue writing philosophy, but I'll just do it on nights and weekends, and meanwhile, I'll keep up some other kind of job. So I worked for a while in homeless services, like working with homeless people. Then I worked trying to get housing for low-income people in Texas. And then I was working teaching English in Mexico, and as a translator in France and in Germany. And I was doing psychology research in Oregon. But then, whenever it would be lunchtime or time for the workday to end, I'd start writing these philosophical papers that I was working on.
Oh, how
But finally, I
interesting.
just had this terrible sense that I kind of wasn't getting anywhere with this life, that I was just doing one thing and then another. And I decided to take the plunge and actually go and become an academic.
Were you always interested? So some of the things that you've done, working for, trying to get low-income housing for people and trying to help the homeless, obviously there's a moral dimension to that. Were you always interested in philosophy as a way of addressing moral questions?
Yes, exactly. So I always really admired these philosophers from the distant past. So people like Nietzsche or Kierkegaard, Aristotle, Plato, Spinoza, who were interested in moral questions, but were interested in these questions not just by engaging in kind of abstract theorizing about the structure of a moral theory, but were trying to make claims about human nature, about what human beings are actually like, and how these questions of human nature can kind of connect back to moral questions.
Were you a religious child? Did you grow up in a religious home?
It's funny that you should mention that. Well, I grew up in a home that was sort of involved in Reform Judaism, so it was not very religious, but I would sometimes have to go to synagogue. And maybe it was that first started making me think about philosophical questions, because I started questioning these ideas that were coming out of the synagogue. I had this sense, there's something really wrong here, and I developed this very militant atheism, maybe as part of a kind of normal teenage rebellion.
Was this part of being exposed? You said that you started reading Nietzsche as a young person. Did that help to turn you away from your religion or belief in God?
It was probably the other direction. That because I was becoming so militant in my teenage rebellion atheism, then that made me develop an interest in Nietzsche.
And so what modern philosophers have had an influence on you?
Oh, people in contemporary philosophy?
Yeah.
The people who have most deep impact on me are people in a kind of new movement within philosophy that's sometimes called experimental philosophy. So, just as I was going to grad school, this sort of new approach to philosophizing was coalescing. And the people who were involved in this approach were people like Sean Nichols, Stephen Stitch, John Doris, Jonathan Weinberg, Edouard Machery. And these people weren't actually at my university, but I was starting to get in touch with them. And they really, even though I was just a graduate student, not someone that any of most people were taking seriously, they really helped me out in a lot of ways and really took me sort of under their wing. And it was maybe that part of philosophy that was having the most deep influence on me.
How old are you, if you don't
34?
mind my asking? 34. And are most of the people who are part of this movement roughly your age?
With some exceptions, but I would say this philosophical movement is a movement that's above all driven by really young people. Actually, if you took a look at just what are the most cited papers within experimental philosophy, I bet you find the majority of them are actually papers by students.
Uh-huh. So, where were you a graduate student?
I was at Princeton.
Uh-huh. And then, and how long ago did you go to the University of North Carolina?
2.5 years ago.
And were you hired there in part because of your background in experimental philosophy?
Well, that was the main thing I had been doing at the time, so it would definitely have been a mistake to hire me for anything else. But so at the time that I was doing this, and still now, it was a very controversial movement. So on one hand, work in experimental philosophy is getting a huge amount of attention within the philosophical world. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people who feel very badly about it and think of it as sort of, this is the decline of Western civilization. Here we're seeing the great tradition of philosophy losing itself in some important respect. So when I was applying for jobs, reactions were very polarized. That some people thought, this work is wonderful, it's so interesting. And other people thought, this is horrible. We have got to find some way of stopping it.
Well, first of all, before you tell us what experimental philosophy is supposed to do, can you define philosophy for us?
No, I can't define philosophy for you.
Does that mean that the definition of philosophy is a philosophical question and therefore is irresolvable?
Yeah, actually the definition of philosophy is not only a philosophical question, but it's a philosophical question that's received a lot of attention, that a lot of philosophers have written about it. So, actually it's interesting, in the 20th century, there were many attempts to define all sorts of different things. So people tried to define knowledge, and they tried to define justice, and so forth. But one of the main lessons of the 20th century philosophy was the complete collapse of this project. All the different people who were trying to define all different things, it seemed like they always failed. Whenever they'd come up with a definition for some proposed concept, so a definition of knowledge or a definition of causation, there would always be some guy in the back of the room who'd raise his hand and say, but what about this? This seems to be an example, say, of knowledge, but it doesn't fall under your definition. Then they'd go back and try to change their definition in some important respect. And maybe you see that same thing happening with philosophy, that people try to define philosophy, but then you can always find some philosopher who's clearly a philosopher, but doesn't fit under their definition. Very broadly speaking... Oh, yeah?
Sorry, well, I was going to... Oh, no, continue. Very broadly speaking...
Very broadly speaking, you might say that the questions that are philosophical questions are kind of the deepest or most fundamental questions that arise within each area. So, say if you're thinking about art, you might have a question about whether some very particular piece of work is a good piece of art. Say, whether some particular song is a good song. That in itself might not be a philosophical question. But suppose you started thinking about the nature of that question you were asking. So you're wondering, ultimately, what is it to be a great piece of art? You started penetrating more and more deeply into these questions about art. Then you would start to be getting to philosophical questions. And similarly, in each of the other kinds of pursuits that you might engage in. So you could start wondering about a particular kind of question within psychology. And if you could at first just wonder about some one little technical question, but then if you started thinking about it more and more deeply, this one question, this one psychological question, eventually you'd arrive at a kind of philosophical question. Questions about sort of most fundamentally how it is that the human mind works, or how we should understand human nature. These would be what most people would consider philosophical questions.
Well, how would you, because science obviously is addressing some of these same sorts of questions. What is consciousness and what is human nature? So how would you distinguish philosophy from science?
Within philosophy, there's been now a really radical breach between different people who answer that question in different ways. So some philosophers think that there is a really dramatic difference between philosophy and science. These are two very different things. Science, they think, is something that proceeds by experimentation and observation. We have to go out and learn things about the world in order to do science. Meanwhile, to think of philosophy as something radically different from science. To think of philosophy as something that you can do from the armchair. You just sit and meditate on these questions. Try to understand the truth about these questions in a purely, as we'd say, a priori way, without engaging in any observation.
Mm-hmm.
The other group of philosophers have exactly the opposite approach to this issue. So the other group of philosophers think, although there might be some distinction between philosophy and science, we shouldn't be too concerned about that distinction. Rather, the two kind of blend seamlessly one into the other. That is to say, it's not as though there's some kind of moat or breach or wall between philosophy and science. Rather, science is dealing with certain kinds of questions, philosophy is dealing with those very same kinds of questions, and philosophers and scientists could work closely together in order to address them. That philosophers are just working on, say, the most abstract, most general, most fundamental issues that we see in the sciences themselves.
Let me propose a distinction between science and philosophy that that has helped me make sense of the difference between the two of them. See if you agree. I see science as addressing a set of problems that can be resolved once and for all, at least in principle, through empirical means. And philosophy is concerned with the set of problems that cannot be resolved, even in principle. And of course, that line can be difficult to draw, and there have been some problems that have been thought to be irresolvable that once we develop more powerful instruments, science can resolve. But then there are others that seem sort of always beyond the boundary of what we can know. Mm-hmm. And those are the sorts of things, whether because of difficulties of language and definition or just because they're beyond the reach of our experiments. And those are the sorts of things that philosophy is concerned with. What do you think about that distinction?
So, traditionally, I think philosophy and the sciences were not really distinguished at all. People didn't really think that philosophy should be some kind of separate thing that had its own distinctive questions. Rather, the people who were called philosophers, traditionally, just worked along with the scientists in a kind of seamless web of just trying to work on these deep questions. Then, in the 20th century, there became this notion within some parts of academic philosophy that academic philosophers shouldn't be concerned with the kind of questions that you are calling scientific, questions that we can really make progress on and try to address, come up with the answers to. Instead, philosophers should just work on these kinds of questions that you're referring to, these irresolvable, perennial questions that no data would ever be able to solve for us. I think what we see now in the 21st century is a movement back to the traditional notion of philosophy. The idea that philosophers aren't just supposed to be working on these irresolvable questions, the ones that you refer to, but also working hand in hand with the scientists and actually making progress on things that we can really find answers to.
And is that is that what you see your role as working closely with scientists and helping them formulate questions and coming up with more precise answers?
Very much so. So, in fact, maybe a good way to get a sense for what the discipline looks like right now is that there are people who have appointments within cognitive science in psychology departments, and people have appointments within philosophy departments doing work in experimental philosophy. But interestingly, many of the people who are working on these questions don't even know which person is in which department. So often if I appear, say, at the Society for Social and Personality Psychology, and people start talking to me, they know my work, but they didn't even know that I was in a philosophy department. Yeah. Similarly, there are people in psychology departments that people thought, oh, that person's probably in a philosophy department. It turns out they're in psychology. So it seems as though what's happening is that this idea that there has to be a firm boundary whereby these people are in this discipline, these people are in that discipline, is gradually being eroded in favor of an idea that there are these questions, we should just go after those questions with whatever methods we can find available, using resources from philosophy, psychology, linguistics, anthropology, and law, but not paying much attention to the distinction among these disciplines, just doing whatever we can to resolve the fundamental question.
What do you think about, I guess my feeling is that, and I see journalism as fulfilling this same role, science has become so powerful in the last over the last century, and it has such a prominent place in our culture now, in spite of the protests of creationists and some fringe anti-science groups, that I think it really needs informed criticism and skepticism. So I see the major philosophers of science of the last 50 years or so, like Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper and Paul Feyerabend, as being in that tradition of really challenging scientists' claims to truth. And I think that can go too far sometimes, but especially when science is telling us who we are, when it is making these claims about human nature and human possibilities, I think it's absolutely essential for science to be questioned and challenged, and that's the role that I think is most important for philosophers. Josh,
Welcome.
we're on. Okay, so we just had a brief technical interruption, and I want to put this comment to you again, and it's this. I guess because science is so powerful, and it shapes our world both intellectually and materially in so many ways, and it has I think, the best claim to truth of any mode of knowledge that we have, that it's essential that scientific claims be challenged, be subjected to informed criticism. I see my role as a journalist as being an informed critic, and to me it seems that the most important function that philosophy can serve today is to perform that same function of criticizing, challenging, questioning the claims of science, particularly when those claims bear on human nature, when they tell us what we are and even what we can be.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And it seems as though often those who have been in a position to see, say, the history of philosophy and to think broadly about a whole variety of different questions, looking at all different disciplines, might be in a especially good position to kind of raise difficult questions for the sciences to answer.
Yeah. All right, so you don't see those two roles as being incompatible, both working with scientists and helping them refine their investigations and challenging and criticizing scientists when you think that they overstate certain claims?
Not at all. And surely it's the scientists themselves who are most often the ones in that latter position, of being the ones raising difficult questions about science.
Yeah. What do you, what's your attitude toward truth? Do you think that truth with a capital T is attainable?
Whether truth with a capital T is attainable.
In other words, do you believe, I guess, I've been struck over the past, especially over the past decade or so, by how many both science journalists and scientists themselves, and of course philosophers, have a postmodern, what I would call a postmodern outlook, in that they think that truth is always provisional in some sense, and that we can never claim to have reached a permanent truth, a truth that will be true of all cultures and all time.
All right.
I just wonder what how you feel about that sort of truth.
The question is an interesting one. So, many times I think that the thing that people were envisioning this truth to be was just perhaps that sort of thing, this kind of deep metaphysical thing that people were seeking, is not attainable. But that maybe we should just downgrade our vision of what truth has to be. And then once we've seen it in a reasonable light, we can say that the things that we're doing, the things that we have discovered, really are true. So abandoning postmodernism, but at the same time maybe we should reject a certain kind of vision of what the truth would have to be in order for it to actually be true in the deepest sense.
Yeah. So you do think that there are certain things we can learn about the world that can become a permanent part of this body of knowledge. And it won't be subject to change because of future investigation. So you've got Karl Popper, who was saying that we can never say that we know something is absolutely true. we can only say that at best it hasn't been falsified yet.
Oh, right. So the two questions are slightly different. So what people like Papa were wondering about was not whether certain things truly are the case, but just whether we can know that they're the case. So the idea that he was suggesting was that we might have a theory, and that theory might be true in the deepest sense, but yet we wouldn't have evidence that proved it was true. It's just that so far we would have had no evidence that proved it was false.
Yeah, okay. Is Thomas Kuhn still a significant influence among young philosophers like yourself?
Well, of course there are fashions and fads in philosophy, so that for a while everyone will be talking about something, and then gradually the interest in that will fade away. But certainly Thomas Kuhn is a very deeply respected philosopher.
Yeah. All right, so experimental philosophy. Can you give us some examples of how that would work from your own research?
Right, so philosophers have forever been interested in questions about people's ordinary intuition about the application of certain concepts. So that if you look back, say, in Plato, he'll be engaging in dialogues, and he'll say, suppose we want to know what courage is. Then we take an example and we say, would this be courage? Then we take another example, would that be courage? Then we try to formulate a theory. Courage is this. And then we test the theory by considering other examples. Well, now we've got a good theory, but what if we consider this case? It seems like that is courage, but it doesn't fall under the theory. Maybe that shows the theory is wrong. So what experimental philosophy is an attempt to engage in that kind of inquiry, but not just by sitting in our armchairs and thinking to ourselves, would this count as courage? Would that count as courage? But rather, by going out into the world and conducting experimental studies of people's intuitions about these topics. Under what conditions do people actually think a particular concept holds or doesn't hold in a situation? So I could give you some examples of certain kinds of experimental studies that I've done.
Sure, yeah, I would like to hear you talk about the examples, but can you tell us how what you just described differs from psychology?
I wouldn't say that it's right to ask the question whether it differs from psychology, given that many of the papers I've written on this topic are actually published in psychology journals. So maybe it wouldn't be right to say that experimental philosophy is a part of philosophy which is then distinct from psychology. Rather, maybe it would be best to describe experimental philosophy as a kind of interdisciplinary movement. So there's a movement that includes people in philosophy, people in psychology, in anthropology and law, who are all kind of working together to address the similar core series of questions. So different people within the movement fall into these different departments, but they're all kind of working together to address the very same sorts of questions.
Okay, so give us an example of how this would work.
So in a typical experimental philosophy study, what would happen is that subjects are randomly assigned to get two different conditions. So there will be a story scene, and the story will differ. There will be two different versions that differ in just one respect. And then people will be asked a question about each of those two different versions. Then we can see whether that one difference between the two different versions is changing people's answers in an important way. Mm-hmm. So I can give you two different versions of a story, and we can talk about how people's intuitions change between them. So here's a story. Suppose that the vice president of a company goes to the chairman of the board and says, okay, we've got a new policy. It's going to make huge amounts of money for our company, but it's also going to harm the environment. And the chairman of the board says, look, I know it's going to harm the environment, but I don't care at all about that. All I care about is just making as much money as we possibly can. So let's just go ahead and implement that policy. So they implement the policy, and sure enough, it ends up harming the environment. Mm-hmm. So after receiving that story, this is the first version of the story. Subjects are simply asked the question, did the chairman of the board intentionally harm the environment? And faced with that question, almost all subjects say yes. In a typical study, maybe 85% or 90% of subjects would say yes. The chairman of the board intentionally harmed the environment. So in that first version, are you getting that same intuition?
Yeah.
Okay, so now the suggestion is maybe the reason you're thinking that he intentionally harmed the environment is because you regard harming the environment as something morally wrong. That it's your moral views that are actually affecting your view about whether he did it intentionally. And the way we can test that is just by constructing another story that's almost exactly the same as the first, but differs in just one way. The way in which it differs is that we take the morally bad thing he was doing, harming the environment, and switch it for a morally good thing, helping the environment. So now the story becomes this. Suppose that the vice president of the company goes to the chairman of the board and says, okay, we've got this new policy. It's going to make huge amounts of money for our company, and it's also going to help the environment. And the chairman of the board says, look, I know this policy is going to help the environment, but I don't care at all about that. All I care about is just making as much money as we possibly can. So let's go ahead and implement the policy. So they implement the policy, and sure enough, it ends up helping the environment. And the question people ask is, did the chairman of the board help the environment intentionally? And there, almost everyone says no. They say that he helped the environment unintentionally.
You know, I should tell you, I told my wife, my wife and I went out to dinner last night for Valentine's Day, and we ended up, thanks to you, Josh, getting in a big argument over this experiment that you carried out.
That's right.
Because I was trying to, because her answers were, she answered the way the majority of respondents to your experiment answered, and then I was trying to tell her that really logically there was a symmetry between the actions of the of this president or CEO of the company in either harming or not harming the environment, because in both cases he was just dedicated to making as much money as possible, and she just she just saw them as completely different and didn't see any logical symmetry between them at all. And I was having a very hard time trying to explain why it was even a paradox. And let me just tell you, I've been actually mulling this over, and I guess this shows that it really is a very clever and deceptively deep experiment. And let me just run this by you, and then I want you to talk about the significance of this, what you see as the significance yourself. It seems to me that we just care more about the situation in which this person committed harm, because that might require intervention on our part. So if somebody is out there doing good deeds to the environment, then that's fine. We don't have to worry about it. We think, that's great, wonderful person, and then we can just forget about it. If there's somebody out there who is doing bad things, those might potentially affect us, and therefore we might be forced to take action on our own part and to intervene in this situation. And so we are much more likely to assign responsibility in this case when there's a negative act than when there's a positive act. So it's sort of a function of our perceived self-interest. That determines how we respond to these situations.
That's a really interesting suggestion. So at first, when people started examining this kind of case, one thing that a lot of people thought was, maybe there's just some very general truth that people think the bad things are more intentional than the good things. There's just something about bad things that makes us react more strongly or think, we've got to take account of that. And there's some general process that makes bad things be regarded as done intentionally and good things not. But an interesting fact is that as we begin investigating this phenomenon further, we can find other cases, different from the one that I just described, in which the good things will be regarded as intentional. So in the case I just described, if you're helping the environment, which is something good, it will be regarded as unintentional. But we can find other cases that work interestingly in the opposite way. Should I give you one?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so let's compare another two cases. But this time, it's going to hopefully turn out that the good one will be regarded as intentional. So first of all, suppose that you're hoping to win the lottery. So you go down to the local store to play the lottery. It turns out the way to play the lottery is that you just you have to guess certain numbers. And if you get all of the numbers correctly, then it will turn out that you win. So you just think, well, I have no idea what the numbers are. I guess I'll just guess randomly. So you say, 2, 6, 7, 1, 3, 9, 2. And then, oh my God, you won the lottery. You were just incredibly lucky. A question now arises, in that case that I just described, is it right to say that you intentionally won the lottery? And there, most people say no. So this is a case in which you didn't do something morally good, you just won the lottery. Most people say you didn't win it intentionally. But now, suppose we switch it to something morally good. So in most ways, it's going to stay the same. It's going to become something morally good, though. So suppose Dr. Evil is trying to blow up the entire headquarters of bloggingheads.tv. So there's going to be this sort of nuclear explosion that's going to destroy all of your offices with all the journalists included. But then Robert Wright intrepidly tries to stop Dr. Evil. He ventures into his lair and gets to the heart of the nuclear reactor that was going to create the meltdown. And he's just about to shut it down when he realizes the only way that he can save all of the people is by entering this special security code. But he just doesn't know what the security code is. So he thinks, well, I guess the only thing to do is just guess. So he just guesses. 2, 6, 7, 1, 3, 9, 2, 1. Oh my god, he was incredibly lucky. He guessed exactly the right number. And then he saved all of bloggingheads.tv. Did he intentionally save bloggingheads.tv? In that kind of case, most people say yes.
Yeah, I would think that, well, to me, the obvious difference between the two cases is that one action helps others, and one action just helps the actor.
Mm-hmm. But, so the significance of the experiment was supposed to be that when you looked at the old one about helping or harming the environment, you might have thought there's just something about doing something bad, like, say, harming the environment, that makes it regarded as more intentional. But in this case, it's coming out the opposite way. That when we have something good, that makes it be regarded as more intentional. So that makes people think maybe we need some more complex kind of account.
Yeah, this is very interesting stuff, Josh. I got to go back to the question of how this differs from psychology. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that what philosophers are supposed to be doing, traditionally have done, is to try to arrive at some moral truth, again with a capital T, a truth that would cut across different situations and times and cultures and so forth. And it seems what you're doing with these experiments isn't figuring out what the moral truth of the situation is. You're figuring out what we think about truth, how we arrive at what we perceive as moral truth. And I guess the question is, can that data then contribute to the question of what the real, truth with a capital T is, or is that question even relevant anymore? Is the significance of these experiments that it's a mistake to think about a truth, a universal moral truth that cuts across all different situations?
Within those people doing experimental studies about these questions, there is controversy with different people having different views about why they're important. But my own opinion is that if people want to get into a debate about what is ultimately the truth as to which behaviors truly count as intentional and which behaviors don't truly count as unintentional, that question really isn't a deeply important question. This isn't really a deep philosophical question. The question which behaviors truly are intentional. There I would just be tempted to say something like, well, just say whatever you want. If you want to call this behavior intentional or unintentional, who am I to argue with you? But there really is another question here that is a very deep question, a question that really has a kind of deep philosophical importance. And that is a question about human nature, a question about what sort of beings we are. So one traditional kind of answer to this question is that human beings, in their very nature, are kind of like scientists. We reach out by our nature for a kind of scientific understanding of the world. So what this view says is, the reason we have concepts like, say, the concept of doing something intentionally is because we want to develop a kind of quasi-scientific understanding of other people's minds. We want to understand how other people's minds work in a way that will enable us to predict and explain those other people's behavior, just as a scientist would. So this view would say there's a kind of ordinary question that we have, questions like whether someone did something intentionally or unintentionally. And that question in itself is a kind of scientific question, which ultimately could be answered using scientific methods. But the view that I'm trying to offer is one that rejects that picture in a really central way. It says that our ordinary way of thinking about the mind is not like the scientific way of understanding the mind. Our ordinary way of thinking about the mind is kind of suffused through and through with these kind of moral questions. So ordinarily, when we want to know, say, whether someone did something intentionally, the fundamental sort of question we're asking isn't really like a scientific question. It's a moral question. It's a question that has something to do with the moral status of the behaviors people are performing. So even if we had all the scientific information we needed, we still wouldn't be able to answer the kind of ordinary question as to whether someone performed a behavior intentionally or unintentionally, because that ordinary question is wrapped up in a really central way with questions of value.
Would it be fair to say that a valuable function of this sort of philosophy would be that if it sort of infiltrates into popular culture, it will get people to question the way that they arrive at moral decisions, and that there's something healthy, that the more we question how we arrive at concepts of right and wrong, both in our personal behavior and our judgments of others, the better that is for everybody.
You know,
that humans get in trouble. So, just the final thought: humans get in trouble when they have moral certainty, and that this sort of critical questioning process is good for us.
You know, I really deeply believe that that's true. So it always seems as though human beings not only feel certain about, for example, the moral judgments they're making, but that they also feel certain about why they're making them. So if someone says, I think this is morally wrong, or this is morally right, and then you say, why do you think that? Then they just answer, I think that because of this, this, and this. That's my reason for my judgment. But it's very rare that someone would, if you asked someone, do you think this is morally right or wrong? They'd say, I think it's deeply morally wrong. And then you'd say, well, why do you think that? And they'd say, I'm not really sure. There are different hypotheses about why I might think that. Some would say, I think it because of this. But then there's also some data suggesting I might think it because of that. People always seem so certain about the way their own minds work. But I have this dream that if people could study these kinds of results, that certainty would gradually erode. And more, if you ask people why they believe the things they do, they would say, it's really an interesting question as to why I believe that. There's some evidence suggesting I believe it because of this, but maybe that's wrong and I'm actually mistaken about why I believe it.
Well, this is exactly the function that I think philosophy should have. So I had said earlier that I think philosophers are most useful when they are questioning scientific claims, particularly scientific claims that really bear on how we live our lives. And you're talking about philosophy, again, that's kind of, instead of philosophy delivering truth, it's philosophy that is critical and skeptical and sort of undermining our certainty about truth. And I agree. I think that is, first of all, I think it is very different from the traditional, the sort of Platonic, Aristotelian concepts of truth, at least as I understand them. But I think it's a very important, if you want philosophy to have social relevance, I think it's crucial for it to have this sort of function of criticizing and questioning our beliefs about ourselves.
I think that this question about certainty has really been an essential one in the development of experimental philosophy over the past couple of years. So that when people first began engaging in these kinds of experimental studies, people would hear the study and immediately form an opinion. They'd say, well, that's probably because of this. But then inevitably there would be someone else who would do a further study that would refute that initial hypothesis. Then a new hypothesis would arise, and that would be refuted. Over time, the most radical change that's occurred in people's views has not so much been that people have changed from holding one view to the other view, but that everyone has just become a lot less certain. So now there are still people arguing with each other, some suggesting that one explanation is right, some suggesting another one is. But by now, people on both sides of the question would easily admit that there's a very, very large chance their hypothesis is going to turn out to be false. They would each say, well, this is just the best we can do with the evidence available, but in 5 years we'll probably see that each of the views that we're holding are actually mistaken, and some other view will now be the leading one.
So there's this great essay in the New York Times Magazine, I guess it was last fall, by Kwame Appiah. Is that how you pronounce his name? Appiah. And it was sort of a gentle critique along with a description of X-Fi. And at the end, he said that it can illuminate but not settle arguments. And I guess that's what you just said, and you think that's a good thing.
Right. So Appiah, who is a great philosopher who's worked on many different topics, was pointing toward this new surge of work in experimental philosophy. And he was trying to suggest that experimental philosophy might help us in addressing certain kinds of questions. But that ultimately, it's not as though just running a whole bunch of experiments will help us to find the truth about the deeply significant questions of our lives. So what he meant to suggest is that we have to engage in experimentation, but then, once we're finished with experimentation, we have to just reflect on these questions and just think deeply, philosophically, about what they might mean about how human beings really ought to live.
Yeah.
So, in discussing this, he uses this image that we very often appeal to in experimental philosophy, the image of the armchair. So, the armchair is sort of the symbol of everything that experimental philosophy is opposed to. So, for example, there was recently a music video placed up on YouTube of the experimental philosophy anthem, which includes an actual video of an armchair going up in flames as the experimental philosophy song is playing. And then Appiah suggested maybe the armchair won't be able to solve all of the problems. But after we've gone out and done all this experimentation, there's a place that we have to retreat to, he says. He says, go back to the armchair. And that's where you'll reflect. Think about the really deep philosophical questions that arise out of these experimental data.
Were you involved in the burning armchair video?
No, but the burning armchair video was created by someone in our department, Jenny Dixon, along with actually my wife, who is a indie rock musician, Alina Simone.
That's great. You'll have to make sure that you link to that when you send the links to blogging.
Okay, I can be sure to include a link to our music video.
So I have to ask you. It seems to me that the issue that's sort of lurking at the bottom of a lot of the issues that you explore in your work is free will,
mm-hmm.
and free will has become something of an obsession of mine over the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that there are lots of different philosophical and scientific issues and social issues that have, when you sort of sift through all the different the things that people are arguing about, you find free will down there at the bottom. So I just wonder what your, I've read a few things of yours that address free will, but I still don't have a sense of whether or not you believe free will exists in any significant way.
So, my answer to that question really goes back to the thing that you were saying could be one of the main products of philosophical reflection. And that is that I think, as I think about these issues more and more, the main change in my view is that I just become more and more uncertain. So, starting out thinking about these issues, maybe I had much more certainty, and as I continue working on them, I just become less and less certain about what the correct answer is. The main topic I've been working on in the study of free will is not just the question of whether human beings really do have free will, but how people ordinarily think about it. Why it is that people think they do have free will, or why they think that they don't.
Yeah. So do you think that free will is irresolvable? Can you imagine a philosophical or scientific solution to free will?
Oh, maybe here is where we get into the meta-uncertainty, where it's not only that I'm uncertain what the answer is, but I'm also uncertain about whether we will find an answer. So it's not that I'm certain we won't be able to resolve my uncertainty.
Let me just tell you, run by, it's very important for me to preserve some kind of belief in free will for personal reasons, as well as, I feel almost as though it's my responsibility as a citizen to believe in free will. And let me just run this justification for my belief by you. It seems to me that free will has got to exist if some creatures have more of it than others. And I think of free will as being proportional to our ability to perceive and act upon choices, and especially significant choices about how we live our lives. So I have more free will than, as a really obvious example, than somebody in prison. I just have more physical freedom. I have more free will than somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder. I have more free will than an infant or most children. And so whatever it is that differentiates me from these other people with less free will, that, it seems to me, we can call free will. Basically, so that's it.
All right. So that is precisely the question of free will. That is the question that philosophers address when they're wondering about these issues. So some philosophers think, just as you said, that you have far more freedom of the will than does someone in prison or than does someone with obsessive compulsive disorder. And then people on the opposite side, what are usually called hard determinists, arrive at the opposite conclusion, that this is all just an illusion, and that you think you have this special property of free will, but that really everything that you do is completely determined by prior events and physical laws, and hence that you don't really have any free will at all. You don't even have more free will than someone, say, in prison or with OCD.
Yeah, but then that makes the whole psychological realm in which we think about the future and we envision different scenarios and we choose one scenario over another, it renders all of that completely meaningless and irrelevant. It just seems to me that is a completely unrealistic way of looking at the world. So I understand in a sense that, you know, all of us are, I mean, I didn't choose to be born. We didn't choose to exist in this particular physical universe. So in a sense, everything was determined from the moment of the Big Bang. That's one way of looking at it, but it seems to me that is totally, it's sort of a parallel way of understanding reality from the way that incorporates psychological states and choices and things like that. And it's the one that includes psychology that I think we've got to embrace and make sense of, and that clearly includes something like free choice and free will.
So those philosophers who reject this idea of free will, what they would say in response to the things that you're saying is that they would say, when we say that there's no free will, we're not saying it's not important to deliberate or think about what to do. We're saying something very different. So what they would say is something like this. If we find, for example, that someone does some terrible thing, the usual reaction is to kind of blame that person, think that we have to be punishing that person and doing bad things in order to give that person what the person deserves. And these philosophers, the hard determinists, would say, that is a mistake. This person who did these terrible things isn't really to blame. This person shouldn't be held morally responsible. Rather, you should just come to understand where that person is coming from. What characteristics about that person's past or the person's genes, the person's neuropsychological states led the person to do what he or she did, and then just act to improve them. So they would say, if we can come to understand that there's no free will and hence no moral responsibility, that we'll come to have a deeper understanding how to deal with people who actually engage in certain bad acts.
Yeah, I guess it seems to me that way of looking at it ignores the fact that some people are really compelled to do the things that they do and have no choice, and other people, I mean, it's just an obvious fact that some people have more choices in the sorts of things that they do or don't do than others. And so if somebody, commits a murder, then we find out that they have a brain tumor that's stimulated, a violence module, then we don't hold that person as culpable, and nor should we, as somebody who's perfectly healthy.
Actually there are some very interesting studies about that question, the question that you just posed within experimental philosophy. So the question that you're posing is, is it the case that if something's wrong with people's brains, we will not hold them nearly as morally responsible as if they were healthy? And the answer is very interesting. So, in a recent study by De Brigard, Mandelbaum, and Ripley, these experimental philosophers asked that very question, the one you're asking. So there were two different conditions. In one condition, subjects were just asked, suppose someone has a neuropsychological ailment, and as a result, they do some bad things. Can they be morally responsible for the bad things they did? And then people said, no. If there's something wrong with your brain, you cannot be morally responsible for what you're doing. Then in the other condition, they changed it just by making it more concrete. So they described an actual bad thing that someone might do. They said something like, suppose someone has a neuropsychological ailment, and as a result of that ailment, he stalks and rapes a woman. Is this person morally responsible for what they did? And there, in the second condition, almost most people say yes. So it seems as though, on one hand, there's something within us that feels deeply that if someone has a brain tumor, for example, they should not be held morally responsible. But on the other hand, even though we have that belief in principle, in the abstract, when we consider an actual concrete case in which something is going wrong with someone, we have exactly the opposite reaction. We find ourselves overwhelmed with this impulse to blame, and as a result, we end up blaming the people, even though there was actually something wrong with a particular brain region.
How useful do you find evolutionary psychology in helping in analyzing the results that you get from your experiments? And evolutionary psychology, just for those very few Blogging Heads viewers who aren't aware of it, is the attempt to understand human nature as something that evolution has bequeathed us over the last couple of million years of human and pre-human history.
See, I'd be really interested in talking about that, but should we talk about the work that I actually did on free will?
Oh, sure, yeah, if you want to...
Whichever you prefer. So, the question that we were trying to address about free will was how it is that people ordinarily think about this deep philosophical problem, the problem of freedom of free will. So, the deep philosophical problem is a problem that divides two different camps of philosophers, compatibilists and incompatibilists. So the compatibilists are those people who think you could have free will and be morally responsible even if everything was completely determined by physical laws. So even if the laws of nature, say the laws of physics, say that given the way things were before the time that you were born, they entail that you will actually do a certain action right now, could still be morally responsible for that action. But then the incompatibilists say, even if the laws of nature, say the laws of physics, are actually entailing that given that you were in a particular state, say before you were born, you're going to do this right now, then you just couldn't possibly be morally responsible for it. Now the question is, how do ordinary people think about this question? Are ordinary people compatibilists or are ordinary people incompatibilists? So the answer we arrived at was a kind of peculiar one. We suggested, just as in the de Brigard et al. Study that I just described, that there are sort of different parts of human beings that pull them in different directions here. On one hand, our capacity for kind of abstract theoretical reasoning is moving us toward incompatibilism. And then on the other hand, our kind of immediate visceral gut response is moving us toward compatibilism. So we tried to design an experiment which would show how these different aspects of people are pulling them toward these different philosophical views. So that even within each of us, not just within the philosophical community, there's kind of an incompatibilist part and a compatibilist part. Mm-hmm. So the way we did this, as in so many studies, is by randomly assigning people to two different conditions. So in the first condition, the abstract theoretical cognition type of conditioning, we described a deterministic universe. The universe is completely governed by physical laws. And then we said, suppose that in this universe, someone does something. Can that person ever be morally responsible for anything they do? The answer was, people overwhelmingly said no. So when the philosopher Sean Nichols and I gave people this experiment, people said, no, if everything was completely determined in this way, you just could not be responsible, you couldn't be to blame, you couldn't be doing this freely. But then we also had another condition, much like in the study that I just described. So Nichols and I gave subjects also a condition in which we said, imagine this deterministic universe. And now imagine this guy in this deterministic universe, Bob. Bob falls in love with his secretary, so he decides to leave his wife and family. And he thinks, how can I do this? Maybe the best way would be to kill them all. So he sets up an incendiary device in the basement to burn his wife and children to death. Is Bob, this particular guy within a deterministic universe, morally responsible? And there, people overwhelmingly say yes. So on one hand, in the abstract, they think no one can ever be morally responsible for anything they do in a deterministic universe. On the other hand, faced with this concrete lurid case, they think Bob in this deterministic universe really is morally responsible. So it seems as though, in terms of how people think about the question of free will, that one aspect of them is pulling them toward one answer, another is pulling them toward another answer, and maybe the reason different philosophers or different researchers arrive at different answers has to do with sort of which side wins out within this internal struggle.
May I pose that same question that I brought up earlier? How evolutionary psychology informs your discussion of these issues?
Mm-hmm. So you're wondering, how can evolutionary psychology explain results like the ones that we've described right here?
Mm-hmm.
You know, in some cases that we've dealt with, it seems like there is a kind of explanation in terms of evolution. These kinds of things are adapted. And in other cases, it seems as though adaptationist explanations seem really elusive, that it's hard to explain it in terms of adaptation. And people instead start to think, maybe this is just some kind of spandrel, or arises not because it's adaptive. But on the question of why it is that people regard others as morally responsible, there really has been a lot of really interesting work within evolutionary theory. So the question is this. Suppose someone has already done some horrible thing. There's no way we can undo it. It's already happened. So why then do we get so upset and start to attack the person and punish them? Often it seems as though doing this kind of thing, actually attacking people, blaming people, seems only to be counterproductive. Why then do we do it? One really interesting answer that's been given was given by the economist Robert Frank. And what he suggested, I think is a really interesting suggestion, is that it's never actually adaptive to go and do these things. Once someone has already done something bad, to start engaging in these counterproductive behaviors of attacking them and screaming at them, doing things that to harm them, that never actually helps. What helps is for everyone to believe that you're the kind of person who would do that if they ever crossed you.
Ah, right. Well, so it's there's sort of a prophylactic effect that this should be reducing the incidence of these sorts of harmful acts in the future.
Yeah, exactly. So the absolutely ideal thing, of course, would be to somehow act like someone who would go completely crazy if you ever did anything bad. But then if you actually did something bad, that I would never respond in any way. But people are pretty acute. They seem to be able to see through you and figure out whether you really are the kind of person who would go crazy if you did something bad. So if people are acute enough, the only way to give off the appearance of being that kind of person is just to actually be that kind of person.
Right. Well, this is also the explanation for extreme male jealousy. So particularly in an era when you have birth control, the sort of Darwinian justification for jealousy, which is to ensure that your mate has your offspring, doesn't really hold anymore. But emotionally, it's still very powerful, and obviously it evolved because it had this sort of prophylactic effect in the past. That if your male rivals thought that you might go psycho on them if you even look at your if they even look at your mate, then they might just leave her alone.
Exactly. So actually going psycho on them might not be in any way helpful. But being the kind of person who would do that might be helpful if people can detect that you're the kind of person who would do that. In some recent experiments, using kind of economic games, people have shown that just having a conversation with someone, you can kind of detect in some ways what kind of person they are. Whether they're the person who would do these certain kinds of counterproductive things that would be counterproductive to themselves when they were placed in their real case.
Josh, I just have to. We just passed an hour, but I have to ask you a question about another paper of yours that I found on the web, which gets into inflation and multiverse theories and cosmology. So we've been talking about psychology and moral philosophy, and there's this whole other realm that you're apparently interested in. So I wonder how you got interested in cosmology and what sorts of issues it raises philosophically.
So the reason that I got interested in cosmology is actually a somewhat unusual one. It's because my father-in-law is an important cosmologist, Alexander Vilenkin. So it just happened.
You're kidding? He's your father?
Yeah, Alexander Vilenkin is my father-in-law.
Sure, right. I'm familiar with his work.
Oh, right. So I just happened to be talking with my father-in-law about his recent work. So he had developed a theory according to which there are only finitely many possible states of any given region, a region of a given size within the universe. So say, if you considered the size of your room, there are only finitely many ways that things could be in a region that size. However, according to this theory, our universe is actually infinite in extent. So there are infinitely many regions the size of your room, but only finitely many possible states of each of those regions. There is then a probabilistic process that determines what states will end up existing within each one of those regions. So there's a certain non-zero probability for anything that would be physically possible to happen in a region the size of your room. So from those three premises, you can deduce that anything that could possibly happen is actually happening in infinitely many regions of space-time at this moment. Well, whether you call it at this moment is relative to an inertial frame, but you could say at this moment. So at this one moment, everything that could possibly happening is happening in infinitely many regions of space-time. So there are infinitely many regions in which someone more or less like you is having a conversation with someone more or less like me about cosmology. But there are some in which our conversation proceeds exactly in this way. There are others in which suddenly you start screaming at me and get really upset about my theories. Others in which, during the course of this conversation, we develop an interesting new innovation in physical theory, which then transforms the whole world of cosmology and so forth. So I had been talking with him about this question, and then we began in our reflections to think maybe this work that he's doing in physics actually has philosophical implications. So we then co-authored a philosophy paper about the philosophical implications of inflationary cosmology.
And what would be the ethical or philosophical consequences of accepting that everything that happens an infinite number of times in infinite space and time?
So one common view within philosophy, by no means the most dominant view, but one that many, many philosophers hold, is that the thing that's morally right to do is the thing that creates the best possible outcome. So, for example, suppose that you think it's good to increase happiness. Then you would just try to do whatever would maximize happiness, maximize the total quantity of happiness. But it seems that this kind of view within physical theory immediately entails that if that is right, nothing we do makes any moral difference at all. So suppose I'm talking with you right now, and you're feeling really depressed and down, and I'm wondering whether to just go on with my day, or can I help you out and have a conversation with you to try to cheer you up? If this view is right, then there are infinitely many people exactly like you, depressed in exactly the way that you are, infinitely many of whom will be helped, and infinitely many of whom will not be helped. No matter what I do, infinitely many of those people are going to be helped, and infinitely many will not be helped. So if what mattered was something like maximizing the total amount of goodness in the universe, then what I did could make no difference at all. So the only way we could arrive then at the conclusion that what I'm doing does make a difference is to arrive at a sort of slightly different view about what is morally significant.
It's funny, Josh. I have to tell you that I wrote a piece. Blinken wrote an essay for a website called The Edge that came out God, it must be almost 2 years ago now. It was sometime in 2006 on multiverse theories, and he was talking about how there was a parallel universe in which Al Gore had won the election, and we hadn't invaded Iraq, and he was just sort of playing with this idea, and for some reason, I guess it was because I had encountered. I had just heard a lecture by the physicist Paul Davies on multiverses and raising the possibility that we live in a virtual universe. That's sort of another side branch of this sort of speculation that this universe is a computer simulation in some other parallel universe. And this all really started to annoy me, and I have developed a very strong moral objection to this sort of speculation. It just seems to me to be, first of all, a waste of big brains and of intellectual energy, and also it kind of it devalues and suggests that we don't need to take this universe right here very seriously, because there is real suffering and very great wrongs being committed in this world right here, and the idea that physicists are telling us that we're just part of this infinite multiverse, it just, I don't know, it just bothers me. So it's funny that you should see this as a spur to moral inquiry, whereas I just kind of reject the whole thing on moral grounds.
That's a really interesting suggestion. Well, first of all, I think it's important to distinguish this hypothesis that we're talking about from this idea of the multiverse. So some physicists, like, say, Tegmark, have offered this kind of metaphysical hypothesis that there are really other universes with other physical laws and so forth. And this is a kind of hypothesis that is not really one that we can test using experimental observation. It seems to have that problem that at least some people would think, as you suggested, well, why do you do this with your big brain? But the hypothesis we're talking about is a very different one, a much more straightforward one. It doesn't have to do with there being other universes in any way. The suggestion is just that our universe, the universe we live in, is very large. It's infinite in extent. These places that we're talking about aren't kind of in a parallel world that would not allow for any observation. These are things that are just very far away. If you just went far enough, you would find another place in which two people exactly like us are having this conversation. So depending on the values of certain physical constants, it might be that we cannot travel fast enough to get there. But it's not in any way in a parallel universe. It's just far away. But the second question that you raised is a really interesting one. The idea that we might reject a certain hypothesis in physical theory on the grounds that it has bad moral implications. So there are these hypotheses. The hypothesis of eternal inflation, which is a hypothesis in cosmology, it seems to entail this conclusion that you find morally suspect. It would be a really interesting suggestion to say we should think that this view of physics must be wrong because it has bad moral implications.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that it must be wrong. I just say that, first of all, this is completely untestable speculation. It's more like theology than real science, because there's no way we can ever get evidence of these other universes. And then I look at what I think might be the practical consequences of believing, for example, that this is some kind of matrix-type reality, just a simulation produced by evil aliens elsewhere. And again, most of the consequences I see of taking that seriously are negative.
But I think it's very important to distinguish this hypothesis that we're talking about from these other hypotheses that you're discussing here. So the idea that there are parallel universes in which all possible physical laws are realized, or that we are a computer simulation, at least you might argue that these are completely untestable, that these are just metaphysical hypotheses that play no role in actual physical theory. So there are people who argue for those hypotheses, and you might think, this is just not playing any role in the actual practice of physics. But the hypothesis we're talking about here is a completely different one from those. It might sound vaguely similar, but it's not at all those hypotheses. It's a very different one. It's just the hypothesis about our universe. And
you happen to be... See, the problem here is that you're talking to somebody who became jaded about inflation and a lot of related ideas in cosmology, a good 15 years ago. So I kind of lump inflation together with all these other multiverse theories and virtual world theories.
Oh, no, don't do that. Inflation is a very testable physical theory.
Okay, I'm going to have to link to a post I just did recently about an encounter I had with one of the creators of inflation, a guy named Paul Steinhardt, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, who now, he hasn't completely rejected inflation, but he thinks that it just hasn't borne as much fruit as it should have by now, because it's been around for almost 30 years now. And so he's gone on to other things. He just thinks inflation has proved to be, this might be putting it a little bit too strongly for him, a dead end.
But oddly enough, that would exactly prove the point. So if Steinhardt concludes that empirical data is indicating that inflation is a dead end, that would prove that inflation was a testable physical theory.
But it's not really that it's been disproven. It's more that inflation comes in so many different varieties, and this makes it similar to string theory, that it's almost impossible to disprove it. And so it really can't be falsified. But anyway, that's another issue. Josh, we're at an hour and 12 minutes now, which is long even for Blogging Heads. And I just got to tell you, so I think we should probably wrap it up. I think the work you're doing, in spite of what I just said about the cosmology-related work, is really interesting, and keep it up. It's fascinating stuff, and I hope you do come back onto Blogging Heads, either with me or some of the other correspondents, or maybe another philosopher.
Oh, I would love
sometime in the future. Okay, that sounds good.
Thanks so much.
All right, I appreciate it. Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope we cross tracks again.
Okay.
So, all right. So, over and out.